No ranked matchups in college football this week. That's when the magic happens. Pac-12 power continues what lies ahead in College GameDay's trip to Boulder for the first time since 1996. And we'd like to welcome Georgia to the start of the 2023 college football season. They finally have a possibly worthy opponent. This is the College GameDay Podcast for Wednesday, September 13th. Rece Davis here. Pete Thamel is on assignment. Bill Connelly will join us in just a little bit. Boy, that sounded official, didn't it? That was like when someone sits in for the usual anchor on the network news and they go, Pete Thamel is on assignment. Pete's doing a story on USC star Caleb Williams. The Trojans are off this week. Big date with Colorado coming up in a couple of weeks down the way, and that could be huge if Colorado takes care of business against Colorado State, and should they be able to pull a monumental upset when they go to Oregon next week. But let's not do that yet. Let's not start projecting ahead just because you look at the slate and you say there are no games matching ranked opponents. Typically, somebody is going to get clipped. Now, who will that be? Well, that's where the magic is. We'll find out if any of that is picked on our Superdogs this week. Georgia plays an SEC game, South Carolina, but they're a 4-touchdown favorite. But really, it's the first team that you feel like might give us an indication of, what Georgia has at quarterback. The first two games appears that they've got a rising star in Carson Beck, very talented guy who's played well. Dogs have been a little sluggish out of the gate, but they've picked it up, and that's what great teams do. And this might be the first time that the Dogs will be very interested at the beginning. Hard to take a team with a long winning streak like that, two-time reigning national champion, against a team that they know that they're going to overpower and really make anything really pressing in their minds about whether they have to be right on top of their game. But they've been solid enough, and I expect that they'll be very good on Saturday. Good enough to cover the 27.5. You'll have to wait until the Friday podcast to find that out. Bowling Green and Michigan. Somebody is calling for the upset in that game. No, nobody on this podcast. It would be one Jack Harbaugh. Bowling Green alum, I believe. Jim Harbaugh's father played at Bowling Green. Jim told a great story this week about his father and mother meeting in an English class at Bowling Green and how he knew the fight song, I Ziggy Zumba, the unofficial fight song at Bowling Green, and even tried to take it to Stanford for a while, but said it didn't really take hold then. But the person calling for the upset of the Wolverines is Jack Harbaugh. And tongue is firmly planted in cheek here, by the way. But Jim did a great impression of his dad and said that Jack has been telling him all week, they're going to come up here and kick your ass. So I don't think Jack is right about that. I think that Michigan's going to be fine and they'll get started as things go along here. But there are other compelling matchups that I think could really give us some drama on Saturday. Tennessee hasn't won in the Swamp since 2003. They've had some bizarre things happen since then. 2007, not really bizarre, but Tim Tebow built his Heisman resume with a huge game in the Swamp, even though Florida didn't have a great year that year, but Tim won the Heisman by their standards at that time. 2015, Tennessee seemingly had a victory in the Swamp, 13-point lead. It was 13 instead of 14 because Butch Jones kicked an extra point in the fourth quarter to make it 13, ended up costing him in a 1-point loss. Even before that, there were all kinds of virtuoso individual performances in this series in the Swamp that went against Tennessee. 1999, Alex Brown wreaked havoc of five sacks and an interception. 1997, the play that might well have ultimately cost Peyton Manning the Heisman Trophy, threw an 88-yard pick six to Tony George. And afterwards, Spurrier, of course, said the Lord's still smiling on the Gators. Turned out to be the only game Tennessee lost. Very close Heisman race. Charles Woodson of Michigan won it, and Michigan, of course, got a share of the national championship that year. So there's been a lot of frustration. Now, Tennessee won in 2003, and that was exercising some of those demons. but the Vols have been wandering in the wilderness for a while. This is a real opportunity against a Florida team that had difficulty getting the right number of players on the field against Utah, which had difficulty with jersey numbers, all kinds of fundamentals that one would think would be all ironed out. But there's just something about being in that environment. Night game in the swamp, desperate Florida team, Tennessee team that looked a little shaky here and there in the early going. There were a lot of reasons for it. There was a weather delay, and they didn't get to run through the tee before their game last Saturday night. But I expect that the Vols will play really well. They didn't play great against Austin Peay. Joe Milton was 1 out of 7 right out of the gate. They had some drops. But I'd be careful. That's one of those where you could be careful. Minnesota and North Carolina. North Carolina escaped again for whatever reason. Appalachian State plays them off their feet every time. And Minnesota, salty on defense, can shorten the game, maybe put a little pressure on Drake May. Got a great defender in the secondary, and Tyler Nubin, who we've already seen come up with a couple of interceptions. The whole Tez Walker thing has been swirling around North Carolina. Might they be ripe for getting clipped? And then with all of the success that the Pac-12 has had and all of the struggles that the SEC has had in non-conference games, are already just one loss short is the SEC of the number of non-conference losses they had all of last season. Well, it took the SEC to knock the Pac-12 off of its perfect pedestal, with Mississippi State beating Arizona in overtime and Auburn somehow outlasting Cal in the wee hours last week. But doesn't that speak to where the SEC is this season more than anything else? That their point of pride is really, hey, we're the ones that stopped the Pac-12 from being perfect. That's a pretty remarkable thing. And the SEC has a few more tests this week. Georgia Tech is at Ole Miss. That's a game that Ole Miss should be able to handle. Missouri is hosting Kansas State in what is one of the more contentious matchups that you might see, because there were some internet trolling, allegedly, potentially, between Eli Drinkwitz and some people before the game last year. The Kansas State players have said this week that Missouri made a bunch of excuses about the weather and different things when the Wildcats smashed them in Manhattan last year. 40-12 was the final. Wouldn't be surprised if things get a little testy there, too. And Missouri's going to want to make a statement. This is their opportunity to do so. And also the 2 warm-up games, about a game that I can't wait for next week. I'm not going to wish away this week. We're going to have great moments. Can't wait to get to Colorado. That's going to be just a cool scene, sellout crowd at Folsom Field, beautiful backdrop. Deion Shadur, Travis Hunter, Shiloh Sanders, all those guys doing their thing. It's going to be really fun. But next week is Ohio State at Notre Dame. And Ohio State has Western Kentucky and an unsung wide receiver coming in for the Hilltoppers in Malachi Corley, who last year led the nation in yards after the catch, nearly 300 more than the next closest guy. And he's been looking forward to this game throughout the offseason. Says he wants people to be like, who is this guy? Might be able to find out if he can get loose. And, of course, last week, Ohio State got Marvin Harrison, Emeka Ibuka going. They've settled on Kyle McCord as their starting quarterback. So even though there might not be the marquee matchups this week, there are still plenty of opportunities for chaos. And then and from a news standpoint, maybe the most intriguing game of them all is Washington at Michigan State. Future Big Ten rivals once Washington makes the move. Mel Tucker will not be there. Mark D'Antonio will be as associate head coach. Apparently, it seems that he's going to be in the booth to help out Harlan Barnett, who is actually now the acting or interim head coach since Mel Tucker is suspended over the allegations that he sexually harassed Brenda Tracy. Tucker has come out with a very strong statement denying all of the allegations. And, here's the issue with this, in my judgment. Number one, you have to do a full investigation and arrive at what the truth is. But if this were an isolated situation, meaning not just for Mel Tucker, but if it were at a place that did not have the recent history that Michigan State has had with horrific sexual misconduct, scandal, allegations, convictions in the case of Larry Nassar, it's something that has cast a cloud over Michigan State for the last few years. And it's something that from a perception standpoint that they cannot afford no matter what. Patience and finding out, which still is important, by the way. But you might be able to say, look, let's arrive at the absolute truth here and see if Mel Tucker is able to clear State's problems over the last few years that are not just isolated to the football or the gymnastics. There were several incidents that have been investigated, well-documented investigations, one of which was done by ESPN. Perhaps there would be a path for Mel Tucker at some point to be the head coach if he is telling the truth, the unvarnished, non-twisted, absolute, complete truth. But at Michigan State, this appears to be an untenable situation to me. I think it's pretty obvious that he's done and that what they do going forward, remains to be seen, whether there's a settlement, what any type of suits or countersuits that are bound to come, how those all play out. And all of that provides an interesting backdrop to a game in which the Spartans are at home. Decent start to the season. Washington is a 16-point favorite in the game. They come in supposedly, ready to dominate this game. Michigan State, has an opportunity when you're that big of an underdog at home to pull a season-defining type of upset against a team that beat them in Seattle last year. But it feels like with all of the chaos surrounding the program right now that any inclination that you might have that Michigan State is going to rise up and beat Washington would be knocked back. I mean, Michigan State, I think, is coming off a week in which Noah Kim, their quarterback, I believe he was Big Ten Player of the Week. But it feels like all negative surrounding the Spartans right now. And from watching Washington against Boise State, returning to on-the-field discussion now, they look like a team that could be in the running for a spot in the college football playoff. Still really early. A lot of improvement needs to be done, but they have some pieces on defense. They obviously have as explosive a downfield passing attack as anybody in the country. And I think Michael Penix Jr. has a real opportunity to work his way into that QB3 discussion once the NFL draft rolls around. But there is one game, the two teams that once played a 9-overtime slugfest, Penn State and Illinois. Penn State on the road, 14.5-point favorite. 11 a.m. local kick. You know how those things get sleepy. And it seems to me that as bad as Illinois looked on Friday night, that stylistically, this might suit them a little bit more. They're not going to have a quarterback, and Penn State's not as good as Drew Aller has been. He's not going to be running around a lot. I don't think there's any way in the world that Illinois wins the game. I don't think they have enough offense. And I think Penn State's really good, too, by the way. But 14.5, sleepy start, maybe a slow first half. What's going on here in Champaign? And all of a sudden, Penn State ekes out there. Maybe that'll be something. Maybe I'll go with our good friend Bert Bielema. I like to call him Bert because of the spelling of his name before we start getting the cards and letters about, it's Brett. How can you not know that? But I'm sure Bielema was disappointed in the showing in Lawrence on Friday night, and they'll be eager to atone, and they've got a really good defensive front. And so they'll at least make the sledding tough for Penn State when they're trying to run the football. Sometimes that feels like that you're a slight saying QB3, the foregone conclusion that Caleb Williams is going to be number one and Drake May is going to be number two. This could be a really deep quarterback class. And that is one of the reasons I think that you're seeing some of the changing at the top of the rankings this year is because of, it was a theme coming in, quarterback questions at the places that have dominated college football playoff spots. I mentioned earlier, it appears through 2 games against overmatched opponents that Georgia's going to be fine there. Alabama's, got a big question at quarterback and what they do Saturday against USF, whether they stick with Jalen Milroe or whether they perhaps explore Tyler Buckner, Ty Simpson as other options. We'll see on Saturday. Clemson hasn't gotten off, especially in the Duke game, to the type of quarterback start that they had hoped, yet the teams that have had good quarterback play have ascended quickly. Texas, Quinn Ewers, play Wyoming this week. See how they follow up with a hangover after that great win against Alabama. I think they'll probably move forward and look like a team that is going to be a season-long contender for that spot. Ewers playing at the level at which he did Saturday night in Tuscaloosa makes Texas a contender. We've talked about Michael Penix Jr., makes Washington a contender. Goes without saying, Caleb Williams in USC, contender. Can Ohio State get that level of play from Kyle McCord? If they do, they suddenly elevate. And Notre Dame, who I've already alluded to with Ohio State next week, with Sam Hartman being even better than I thought he might be at Notre Dame up to this point, that's a big test next week. And if Hartman continues to play at that level, then Notre Dame is now in the mix too. Bo Nix at Oregon, he's going to get marquee opportunities over the next few weeks. The teams, with the way the game is played now, if you have elite quarterback play, that's what's going to lift you into playoff contention. People want to know, what happened with Alabama. Well, they've had a ridiculous run at quarterback. Jalen Hurts, Tua, Mac Jones, Bryce Young. Even before that, Blake Sims and Jake Coker played really well, and they haven't gotten that or didn't get that against Texas on Saturday night. Clemson hasn't gotten that yet. I almost left out Michigan. Michigan has had almost perfect quarterback play from J.J. McCarthy, yet there have been no tests. There will be in the not too distant future for the Wolverines. Joining us now, as he does weekly, is Bill Connelly, absolute expert, a virtuoso on the numbers, as it were. My perception, Bill, is that you look at the schedule this week and you have no games matching ranked opponents. So this is when the magic of college football happens. This is when the memorable upsets occur. This is when teams go to Champaign, sleepy start, they get clipped. All the Penn State fans think I'm calling for that. I am not. They don't have enough offense to do it, I don't think. But early starts, Florida State's on the road early, you get sleepy, all of a sudden you find out you're in trouble. This is all institutional knowledge and hunch and years of being in the college football studio and then at College Game Day telling me this. You, however, have documented data, numbers, math that say that this is highly likely to happen.
Yeah, this is, any hardcore college football person should understand, look at the schedule and your first thought is, oof, I don't know, there's nothing here. And then it gets that movie kind of feeling that it's quiet. It's too quiet. Something is going to happen. And I think basically, my take on it for my Friday column is just going to be, you start mashing odds together here. You got 7 top 15 teams playing on the road. There's only like a 15% chance that they all win. Don't ask me who's going to lose. It's probably not going to be Florida State or Alabama. Alabama's never played well and never won an easy game in Tampa, but they've never played USF in Tampa. It's always been bowl games and whatnot. So, LSU is in kind of a dangerous place. Tennessee could be in a dangerous place. Maybe Washington. I don't, the whole Michigan State thing is a little odd right now, but Kansas State, technically they've looked a lot better than Missouri this year, but it's their first road trip. So Penn State maybe, but there are some opportunities here, and history tells us that not all the favorites win. So somebody's going to go down. We just kind of have to keep our head on a swivel here, looking for who it's going to be.
I spent some time talking about the Washington-Michigan State game. Ordinarily, you might think it would just be a spot where they would get clipped. Sort of went through all of the issues surrounding the Michigan State program. I feel as if rather than galvanizing that this is probably more distracting, but even on top of that, even if this situation hadn't occurred, I feel like Washington's legit, and I don't know if they cover that big number or not, or would have otherwise, but I feel like that they will. I feel like they'll go in there and win fairly easily. Mississippi State is tempting, but it always seems like for whatever reason that they don't play LSU great, and I know it's a different regime, different offense and things like that. They seem to give other teams a little more trouble than they've given LSU. And I know Dak got him a few years ago, but it's been a minute now. And maybe there was another one somewhere in there that I've forgotten. Well, I guess, I guess the year that Leach took over, they went and got him pretty good, unleashing the air raid offense. And then the history with Tennessee and Florida. I mean, Vols haven't won there in 20 years. But the one I want to start with you is your alma mater, Missouri and Kansas State. You touched on it just a little bit, but sort of low key, these two teams, as they say, just plain don't like each other. Fair enough?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and they recruit against each other reasonably often. And I mean, so it is kind of, it's become kind of the modern rivalry where you don't actually play each other on the field, but you still kind of bicker at each other because you're in approximately the same neighborhood. And so I do think there's going to be, it's a sold out crowd. Kansas State's going to bring plenty of people to town and for their first trip here since like 2010 or 11, I guess. And it should be, Missouri's going to have a chance. The problem is Missouri has gone in the opposite direction of Kansas State since the season began. I think using preseason projections, my SP Plus ratings had this as like a KSU by a half a point kind of situation at the beginning of the season, and now it's K-State by 10.2. And that kind of spells it out pretty clearly. They've been, for both of these teams, they've played two of their weakest opponents on the schedule, maybe the two weakest opponents on the schedule. And so it's one of those deals where when I'm looking at stats, I'm like, it's never going to look better than this in terms of the raw rankings. And it's also, if you're weak in a specific area, that's a major, major, major concern because it's only going to get harder from here. Well, the only weakness I really see on the K-State side, not a lot of big run plays, which obviously in the post-Deuce Vaughn era, that was going to be kind of hard to match. And they do kind of go 3 and out a lot. It's been kind of an interesting situation where once they get that first down, they're going to go score. But they've gone 3 and out almost 1/3 of the time so far. So that's something on the K-State side. The defense has been outstanding, though. And Missouri, for all of K-State's problems in the explosiveness category, Missouri just makes no big plays, period. They have athletes, but they just have not been able to turn that into any explosiveness. So their efficiency numbers are fine. They are among the bottom 30 or 40 teams in terms of my explosiveness ratings, which after playing South Dakota and Middle Tennessee is a very scary sign. And if they can't create easy points, which a lack of easy points is why they struggled to pull away from Middle Tennessee last week, it's gonna be a struggle. So we'll see. Eli Drinkwitz says that that we have the athletes, we just haven't executed. And if that's true, then sure, they can start making some big plays and they'll be able to scare K-State. But until we see that, this is definitely a K-State advantage.
Regular season games against opponents from other Power 5 conferences. Regular season, Kleiman's 3-0. They've beaten Mississippi State, Stanford, Missouri, and they've beaten them by an average of nearly three touchdowns, about 17 points per game. I always, when coaches say things like that we have the players, we just aren't executing. Well, they have to.
Yep.
They sure can't say, what our players
we just don't have anybody.
Good. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, or we have a particular problem at quarterback that we can't use this player and that player as effectively as we would like if we had a higher level of play at quarterback. So, I mean, I don't blame them for saying that, but and it is true.
Yeah.
That's something that I don't want to digress off of the numbers too far here, but I hear people sometimes complain in the aftermath of games that, coach was making excuses. No, when a coach goes into a news conference after a game or talks with a reporter about what happened, what you're trying to find out is why didn't things go better from your perspective? And they say, why don't you just tell the other guy they played a great game and they whipped you? Well, that's not terribly interesting. You want to know from the winning coach, why were you able to win? What went right for you? How did you exploit those matchups? Why did that big play occur? And from the losing coach, what caused that turnover? Why did you give up X number of sacks? How come your defense busted that coverage? And so that's sort of a coach's nature. This didn't go well. because we were supposed to do this. Instead, we did that, and if we did this like we were supposed to, then we would have had a better chance at succeeding. Yet I don't know why people get so mad about that and think it's making excuses. That's what we want. We want the winning coach to tell us what happened to allow them to win, and the losing coach to tell us what they missed on and what could have gone better for them if they were going to win the game.
Yeah, I mean, we do always try to really, really play the semantics game there, and we always, he was throwing his players under the bus, or he was throwing his play callers or whatever. But no matter what they say, they're blaming themselves in the end. If the quarterback played terribly, it's his fault. The quarterback played terribly. If the offensive coordinator made terrible play calls, where he hired the offensive coordinator, it's all on him no matter what. We might as well, get the most honest possible answer out of it. And that's always kind of I've learned to kind of just tune all of that out, because, people are going to figure out when their team loses, they're going to figure out a reason to be mad about it one way or the other. And whatever the coach says, they're going to be mad about that too.
Jesse Palmer tells a great story from his time at Florida. It was not an interception that Jesse threw, but another of the quarterbacks he was competing against. And Spurrier, according to Jesse's story, which may or may not have been embellished, but one of the great storytellers. Jesse tells the story. Guy throws the interception. Spurrier comes over to him, pats him on the back, and says, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's us dumb coaches for putting you in that position." So it's anyway.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been an embellished Spurrier story. I think they're all true. So that fits.
Probably so. What else are you watching? Is the number too big in the Georgia-South Carolina game? Because I don't see any way in the world the Gamecocks can win, and I'm probably foreshadowing my pick on Friday a little bit. But this feels like 41-14, 41-17, and that's a cover for South Carolina. It's like 27.5, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, with SP Plus, it says 39-16, so even more of a cover for South Carolina. And the numbers really don't like South Carolina at all. They've fallen from 31st to 39th since the start of the season. I think what's really, really interesting about the teams at the top, or maybe this is the opposite of interesting, really, none of them have really played yet. And I don't even mean like they haven't played good opponents, but they haven't even really cleared the like SP Plus. Georgia's underachieved by, underachieved by about 8 points against UT Martin, about 9 points against Ball State. Michigan's underachieved projections twice. Ohio State has as well. It's hard to figure out if there's anything, any signal in that, as they would say, or whether it's all just, they knew they were going to win. They know they have bigger games. We're just going to play things real straight and eventually we'll pull away. Like Georgia has started 2 straight games extremely slowly on offense, less so against Ball State. But basically, my numbers see that, and they see a team that is clearly the best in the country, but maybe not as dominant as we thought. And maybe they're only 23 or 24 points better than South Carolina. We'll see. This is first game where they actually have to hit the gas a little bit. And South Carolina is a team under Shane Beamer. Like, they'll throw haymakers at the big teams. Like, it might get them knocked out. They've been blown out quite a few times under Beamer, but they also beat Tennessee and Clemson in last season. So I do think we'll see, Georgia's going to have to play. And maybe we find out that once they actually hit the gas, everything's fine and they're better than ever. But they haven't been yet. And this will be a nice test for them to ease their way into the season, I guess.
Which brings us to this big picture topic about the SEC's non-conference struggles. Relatively speaking, of course, relative to their typical excellence or dominance. What do your numbers say about that?
Yeah, the SEC still has the best overall average just in terms of average ratings, but it did go down by about 1.5 points after last week. They're still pretty far ahead of the pack because they still have Georgia, and for all the disappointment about Alabama, that's still probably a top 5 level team or top 10 at the very, very worst. And so they still have the most good teams. Most of their teams are in the top 30. But yeah, I mean, you had a lot of teams move down from the 20s to the 30s and stuff like that. Kentucky sleepwalking past Eastern Kentucky, Tennessee sleepwalking past Austin Peay, Missouri getting out ahead and then just kind of stopping against Middle Tennessee. There were a lot of games that were closer than they should have been. And then obviously the marquee games, Alabama, Texas, LSU, Florida State went the other way. So basically, I do. It's still the best conference overall. The Big Ten hasn't just covered itself in glory so far this year by any means. And I'm not ready. As fun as the Pac-12 is, I'm not ready to say it's at that level just yet. But it has been disappointing. Alabama is not the best Alabama. LSU is not the best LSU, and we'll see exactly who improves moving forward. And we'll see what that means for Georgia too. Obviously, I'm not going to pretend like they don't get in if they go 11-1, even with a weak-ish kind of schedule. But they, among other things, if they're really not going to be tested all that much until November, I don't think that's good for a team. I don't think, if you don't have to show what fifth gear is all that often, I don't think your fifth gear is going to be as good when you actually have to show it. So that's going to be kind of an interesting subplot. Can South Carolina do Georgia a favor by actually testing them a little bit, or Auburn here in a couple more weeks, or Kentucky? I don't know if they will, and that's probably not good for Georgia.
The thing that would delight every fan outside of the SEC is for a 2-loss Alabama, a 2-loss LSU, a 2-loss, Ole Miss, whoever, to come in and upset Georgia in the SEC championship game. Then Georgia wouldn't really have a huge marquee win. Let's say they're undefeated. Under that scenario, maybe Tennessee's got a couple of losses too. They don't have a huge win. They don't have a lot on their resume. That would be the nightmare scenario for the SEC, and the one that, all of the other fans in the other conferences dream of. Not predicting it, and I think you could very easily still make the case that Georgia would be one of the 4 best teams. But because of the SEC's non-conference performance up to this point in the season, it doesn't feel as if there's this big separation, and it doesn't feel like an absolute no-brainer. And it would bring, depending on what everybody else across the country, if everybody's got a loss, then probably it's, still the same thing. But if you were to have a couple undefeated teams, a couple other conference champions, it would at least bring it into question. And maybe, it would be a different scenario a little bit, because Georgia would have made the championship game, but it would be somewhat like that 2015 Ohio State team that everybody kind of knew was one of the best, but they didn't always play their best. And then they lost the wrong game at the wrong time and didn't even make it to the Big Ten championship game. And circumstances conspired against them. That's probably something that we ought to at least put somewhere in the recesses of our mind as the season goes, if you want to lend some big picture perspective to the importance of the SEC not performing to its usual standards, or other teams. Let me rephrase that, because I don't want to make it all about them. The teams from the other conferences elevating their games and proving that they're just as good. How about that? That's probably a better way to put it.
Basically what we've seen in this playoff era is that, most of the time, if you get to the end of the season with 1 loss, you're probably going to get in, but it's not guaranteed. It didn't happen for Ohio State. It didn't happen for Baylor and TCU that first year. Usually I would assume a 12-1 Georgia makes it in regardless, but it depends on everybody else. And right now you can certainly look at the Pac-12. Maybe they still beat each other up, and the conference champion has 2 losses, but they're going to get through non-conference with all of their teams pretty much unbeaten. Mm-hmm. And, that increases the odds of whoever wins that conference being 12-1. Florida State looks like they have pretty good odds of finishing 12-1. The Big Ten champion is probably going to be 12-1 or 13-0. So you look at it like that, and upsets are going to happen and screw up everything we think we know. But right now, you can certainly paint a picture of a 12-1 Georgia having a much, much weaker resume than a bunch of other 1-loss teams. That'll be really interesting to see what the committee does with that.
Listen to us, Bill. Listen to us. Listen to what we did. We spent the first part of our conversation going, boy, wait till you see all these big upsets that are happening. And then both of us immediately go, after Georgia goes 12-0, what?
Everybody's going 13-0.
After Washington goes 12-0, after SC, rolls in there, it's human nature, I think.
It's hard not to. It's hard not to. We know what the odds say, and we know what our eyes have told us so far too.
So what are you looking forward to this week? Which games really have your attention that might be a little bit out of the spotlight?
Well, I think for obvious reasons, Washington, Michigan State is a lot less fun to talk about than I thought it was going to be. But I am very curious about one aspect of that game. And that's the fact that Michigan State right now, after two obviously pretty weak opponents, they're first in the country in sack rate. And the one thing that we have never really seen from Washington in the Kalen DeBoer, Michael Penix Jr. era is what happens when Penix gets pressured, because he's just he does a good job of getting the ball out quickly. He has a good line in front of him. And he hasn't played very many good pass rushes through, whatever it's been now, 15 games or so. So if that's real, if Michigan State really does have a plus pass rush, they haven't had to blitz that much to get a lot of pressure. And that almost kind of worries me because they will have to, try to pressure Penix. But if that's real and he's under a lot of pressure, then you can easily slot that game into kind of the stereotypical road upset kind of scenario where, the quarterback's getting hurried, maybe throws a pick or two early on, home team builds, gets early momentum and an early lead and all that. So that one kind of fits a mold of an upset, but obviously it's going to require Michigan State to show up and play really, really hard despite everything that's happened over these last few days. And we'll see. I never like to make predictions about that because you never know, but it's certainly they've got a lot of distractions on the plate right now.
It's and it really goes back to an off-season theme, which we got me particularly got teased about every time we would do a preview of a team. I would bring up the offensive line, right? Because I feel like that cohesion, continuity, a little experience. It doesn't mean you're good just because your guys have played a lot. And it doesn't mean you're bad if they haven't. But the communication that you have to have up there that a lot of people, I think, take for granted. Everybody understands they have to communicate. Every fan understands that. But the level of it and really trusting each other in who to pick up, how to adjust protections, all of those types of things, oftentimes goes better if you've had guys who've played a lot. Washington doesn't. Coming into the season, they had like 36 career starts, something like that. It was toward the bottom of the nation. But I talked to somebody close to that team right before the season started. He said, "You're right." He said, "But feel great about the tackles. Feel great about the tackles, and we think we're going to be fine. Understand your point, but we like the guys on the edges." And that's a great place to start if you're going to try to protect a quarterback and allow him to use those great weapons that they have. So I agree with you with the way Michigan State gets after the quarterback. That will be a real test, not only for Penix, but for these tackles that they feel great about and for the rest of the offensive line if they can perform up to standards. And if they do, look out, because that was the only problem.
Yeah, I think it is pretty easy shorthand to in this era where to win the national title, you probably have to beat either Alabama, Georgia, or both. It is pretty easy shorthand to basically, if you don't know who's really a contender or who's not, look at the quarterback and the two lines, and that'll tell you. Like that's how Texas beat Alabama the other day and almost did it last year, actually. And we'll see with Washington. They have, their numbers were excellent last year and they're very good so far this year. And we'll just see what happens when they play better teams. Michigan State's a nice step forward in that regard. But there are still better teams on the schedule later on. And it's when Penix has time, he's going to beat just pretty much any defense out there. And we'll see if anybody can make him not have time, I guess.
My low-key underrated thing that I want to watch this week is, assuming he's at full health, is Western Kentucky wide receiver Malachi Corley. Great after the catch. Off season, he didn't make any boastful predictions or anything like that, just how much he was looking forward to playing in the horseshoe against Ohio State with Marvin Harrison Jr., who best receiver in the country and was last year. I think Emeka Egbuka, who's one of the best. Corley, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Bill, led the nation in yards after the catch last year and had nearly 300 more. The jersey number, he looks like a slightly smaller Julio Jones, and a lot of people have likened him more stylistically to Deebo Samuel in the way. I mean, he runs through guys sometimes. So from your numbers, will Malachi Corley, if assuming health, because he had a lower leg injury, I think that it slowed him. I don't think he played last week. Will he have the opportunity to make people do exactly what he said when he said he wanted people to come out of that game and going, who is this guy? Will he have the chance?
Well, I think I love this game for Ohio State right now for that very reason. Western Kentucky is going to throw the freaking ball, and they do it in a little bit of a different way. Like you said, I mean, they're really good at getting guys in space, often pretty close to the line of scrimmage, and letting them run into that open space. It works really well. That is kind of the definition of, Tyson Helton a couple of years ago had a terrible offense, so he went and hired a great offensive coordinator. And even though that coordinator left, the offense is still in place, and they're just 5,000 passing yards a year. Like, it makes it seem like these things are really easy to fix the way he fixed them. But Austin Reed and Corley and these new guys who have stepped up with Corley not playing as much, Easton Messer, Dalvin Smith, Katie Hutchinson. This is the best receiving core that they've played so far. Ohio State, better than Indiana's, I think. And we're gonna find out if Ohio State's defense is as improved as it has looked like they are so far. It'll also give Ohio State probably a pretty good chance to find a rhythm defensively, because Western Kentucky's defense is very good. So it'll work for them in that regard too. But no, I mean, they will have a very good chance to kind of earn some national attention. Western Kentucky will in this game, and I assume they. Youngstown State had an easy drive early on in that game last week before Ohio State really found a rhythm. Maybe the Hilltoppers can do the same and make this interesting for a while, especially if the Ohio State defense remains in third gear, as it has been so far this year too.
Can you imagine the angst in Columbus if Western Kentucky has a couple of chunk plays in the early going and scoring early and worrying about peeking ahead to Notre Dame next week? And I mean, of course, then again, now that they've completely settled the quarterback issue, if they could, at least for now, if they could settle the third down problem, I think they're, toward the bottom of the country on third down. They settle that. They might also go up 21-0 after 3 drives and be cruising to South Bend, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, Western in that regard too, it is going to be exhausting playing them, because even if they're down 14-0, they're still just going to be. It's like the old Mike Leach teams. They're just going to wing the ball 70 times if they have to, and you're going to have to keep defending. So, the DBs are going to work out if nothing else.
I think one other thing I want to hit on in the game is a little bit off the radar, and because of the way Texas handled Alabama, the question becomes, what's next for Alabama? Do they stick with Jalen Milroe? The errors were obvious and catastrophic, whether, it was the 2 terrible interceptions, the 2 touchdowns called back because of offensive penalties, both of which were pretty obvious, with a lineman downfield, and certainly the hold. There was a tackle basically in the backfield by the freshman left tackle who struggled a lot. What did your numbers say about the type of quarterback player, offensive efficiency that Alabama got on Saturday night? And what do you think it means for them from this point forward?
I mean, the biggest thing the numbers say is that Milroe's not getting much help. Obviously he didn't play incredibly well. And really what we saw, my biggest concern coming out of the Middle Tennessee game ended up being pretty justified. And that was just that, as I wrote it in my Friday column, there was just a big gaping hole in the middle. It was all just like quick sideline passes and then 3 gorgeous bombs. And we talked about this last week. And those bombs were gorgeous and they were easy points. And he hit another one to Burton on Saturday. But against anybody who actually kind of, was able to stop the run and render it inefficient and make him actually use the entire, everybody's entire route trees and whatnot, that was going to be something we didn't know the answer. And he didn't do just an amazing job in that regard. But I'm looking at the numbers right now. Their rushing success rate, their ranking in rushing success rate is 60th. In the marginal explosiveness number that I always lean on for explosiveness, for measuring that, they're 75th in rushing marginal explosiveness, and they're just the offensive line is blowing blocks and allowing pressures and committing penalties, and just he's looking around at a supporting cast that is not what existed there 3, 4, 5 years ago. We saw this last year too. Obviously, Bryce Young had a decent amount to overcome, and overcame most of it. But you're looking around there, and it's just not the Alabama offense that we know. So I don't think changing quarterbacks is going to solve any of that. Maybe one of the other two guys is just better than Milroe, but at the very least, Milroe can scramble and offer some run efficiency of his own. And that kind of seems like a necessary thing right now. You got McClellan averaging 3.8 yards per carry, Milroe or Williams 3.7, Jay Miller 3.3. That's horrible. And obviously, that includes a game against Texas, which is one of the better defensive fronts they're going to see. But this is the problems that exist right now are far beyond Milroe. I don't know if a quarterback change is going to help with any of that.
It'll be interesting to see if they do it. And also, the running backs are good. Miller, I think, was the guy they had hoped would give them some explosion, but I think he maybe has some, I'm not sure they fully trust him in pass protection yet. How soon until they go to one of the two freshman backs that have been ballyhooed in the offseason? Do they try that a little bit? Or do they try a new quarterback to try to get some more efficient play? Because, there are things that go into running an offense that you only know if you're in the room watching the film afterwards. There are things like, why didn't you check here? Why didn't you adjust here? Why did you read this instead of that? All of those types of things that you look at it and the numbers will tell you one thing, your eyes will tell you something, but the educated evaluation from the coaching staff when they watch the all 22 and they say, this was here, this was the read, why didn't you take it? Or this wasn't here and you blew the block and now we've got to find a new, guard or center, whatever it is. Those are the types of things sometimes that we overlook, but the numbers, I agree with you, suggest that there are problems other than Jalen Milroe, and the ceiling for Jalen Milroe is still enormous because of his physical gifts, but you can't afford the catastrophic errors that happened on Saturday night. The interceptions were pretty egregious.
The second pick, especially, he just doesn't even see the safety who's standing right in the path of the ball. Like that was a devastating one at the time that it happened too. So that was, I don't want to pretend like this, that he is fine. He has improvement to do too, but it is, that was pretty bad.
It was kind of funny. I hesitate to tell this story. My daughter was with me at the game. She roots for Alabama, and she unwittingly was in the background of the McAfee show shot. And when that happened, it was right in front of us. She put both of her hands over her face because she's not in sports media. She's an actress. She hasn't. She's not really encumbered by the show no emotion on the sideline either way, and put both her hands over her face, and her friend, one of her boyfriends, saw it and sent her a screenshot of it. So I told Pat about it. I guess I can tell it on the podcast because I mentioned it to Pat when I was on his show afterwards for a few minutes there. So anyway, she saw it, but poor Jalen Milroe didn't at the time. But I still believe in his potential. Now, whether they can weather the mistakes to get there remains to be seen, and probably get some answer to that against USF on Saturday afternoon. Bill, I'm going to leave you with this one. We've said at the very top, and I know that you are a numbers evaluating guy more than anything else. You like to rely on your numbers. If you're going to find one, if you're going to pick the shocker, which one would you go for? Which ranked team is going to step on a rake and hit themselves in the face on Saturday?
Tennessee.
Whoa. Do you know what that would mean for Billy Napier?
I know.
That
would mean a lot for a lot of people.
As awful as they looked against Utah. And I don't mean that to take away from Utah. Utah is a better team than they do. And they just whipped them. But getting people on the field, two of the same number on the field, the clock. Just so many things. If they beat Tennessee, You're saying you're not calling it though. You're saying that is the most likely one.
If an upset happens. I'm just worried. We're talking about slow starts and everything. Tennessee started the game against Virginia, touchdown, turnover on downs, punt. And against Austin Peay, they started punt, field goal, turnover on downs, field goal. And Florida's better than those two teams. I don't know if they have a better defense than Virginia. Virginia at least has a good defense, but they're going to have to show up more than that. And maybe they will. It was the same thing I said about Georgia. Maybe everything's fine when you really have to try. But that's not what I was looking for from the beginning of the Joe Milton experience. And they're going to have to show up better than that.
If that happens, Bill, then there will only be one way to explain it. Whip. God smiled on the Mighty Gators again. That would be the only way to explain it. The great Bill Connelly. Bill, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
College Game Day on Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time from the business field at Colorado. You will not believe what we've got cooked up for this show. It's first time there since 1996. I've got to verify this. I believe that show was pre-Lee Corso headgear, though there was a headgear involved. We'll explain all of that on Saturday because it's a historic day, the 400th headgear pick of Lee Corso's storied career. Going to be a great morning there. Deion Sanders will be with us on the set, all kinds of surprises, and we'll see which of these games that Bill and I just spent a lot of time talking about turn out to be upsets. Which ones are the most likely ones? Will it be Florida over Tennessee, as Bill thinks is most likely, if he didn't pick it, but if there is one to occur? I might have other ideas about that. We'll share that on the Picks podcast on Friday, also on Super Dogs on Saturday morning on College Game Day. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. Pete Thamel on assignment doing a story on USC star Caleb Williams. Look forward to seeing that. Ask you to subscribe to our podcast. That's the easiest way to make sure it winds up right on your device so you can listen without any entanglements. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.